The Haunted Mansion begins with Jim Evers and his wife Sarah. They are successful realtors in the real estate business in the state of Louisiana. Then Jim gets a phone call from his wife Sarah just letting him know that there's a reservation all set up at a restaurant so they can eat out later. And of course, Jim agrees to go out with Sarah, but under one condition if he promises to not be late. So he agrees. Together, he and Sarah have two children, Michael and Megan. We'll get to them later. Long story short, at the Evers residence, that's when Jim apologized to Sarah for forgetting to take her out. And so, to make up for it, he gave her a stuffed bear and a watch to go with it. Oh, by the way, it's the night of their anniversary. So Sarah forgives Jim and then told Jim that it is because of his hard work habits that he didn't spend any time with his family. So to make up for it, he suggested they can all take the weekend off. Sarah agrees with Jim's suggestion that they can all go out to the lake together, just like they did the year before. So Jim goes upstairs to tell his kids the good news, and that's when he sees Michael and of course his sister Megan. Told you we'd get back to them later. And of course, Michael is afraid of spiders. So what Jim did after he goes to Michael's room, being the father as he can be, that's when Jim told his son Michael that it's about time he's facing his own fear. So after, long story short, Megan took care of the spider situation for her brother, back downstairs, Sarah was speaking with someone over the phone. And someone just told Sarah that there's a mansion up for sale and his owner is moving on. So, after Sarah wrote down the mansion's address, that's when Jim came downstairs and looks at it. So, Jim, Sarah, and their kids went to the old mansion the very next day. So, after they arrived, that's when Jim finds it weird that there's nobody answering. Long story short, after the gates opened up, that's when the Evers's car went inside. Jim then was driving the car. After he found a place to park, he got out of the car, so did his wife and his kids. So Megan looked around the back and saw there's a huge cemetery. Sarah then looks at it and told Megan that sometimes most of the houses have outdoor pools and even cemeteries. So when it was starting raining, so it was now time for the Evers to go inside the mansion. So Jim went ahead and knocked on the door and everybody went inside. Long story short, now that everyone's inside, they're in the hallway. And that's when Jim and his family met up with Ramsley the butler, who just showed up. So what Ramsley did is that he's asking Jim and his family to follow him to the dining room. So they did. So in the dining room, that's when Jim and his family had met up with Edward, the owner of the mansion. Then long story short, after the children agreed to sit at the table to have dinner, Jim and Sarah continued to have a conversation with Edward. Then Edward explained to Jim and Sarah about the mansion, its history, and everything else. Back with Ramsley the butler, he just told Jim and his family that there's bad news. There's a terrible storm outside, so nobody's going anywhere. But Ramsley was more than happy to take everybody upstairs, so that's what he did. So now that everyone's upstairs, Michael and Megan were put into one bedroom, while Sarah and Jim were in the master bedroom. So after Ramsley left, that's when Sarah had decided to confront with Jim. So Sarah went first to plead her case to Jim that they weren't even supposed to be at the mansion to begin with. To make Sarah's case absolutely clear, that's when she told Jim that work is all he ever cares about anymore. Then Jim pleads his case to tell her, well, it may be true as long as he brings gifts for her. And that made Sarah disgusted and upset. Back with Jim, who had regretted his words to Sarah, that's when Ramsley shows up to tell Jim that Edward needs to see him downstairs in the library. So Jim agrees and he heads off with Ramsley. Meanwhile, in the library, long story short, Ramsley the butler and Jim had a conversation with each other. After Ramsley left, that's when Jim is all by himself, until Jim saw something very interesting, a secret passage. So he goes inside, only to find out that there's a problem. He's trapped in there. With Megan and Michael in the other bedroom, that's when they realized that they weren't alone. They just saw a ghost ball. And so what the ghost ball did is that it's asking them to follow it. So they did. Back with Jim, at the moment he's still stuck in the catacombs. As for Sarah, she just left the master bedroom and spotted Emma the maid. She was asking Emma if she's seen Jim anywhere. Instead, Emma ran off. Suddenly, Sarah just ran into Ramsley the butler, so she asked Ramsley if he had seen Jim. As a matter of fact, according to Ramsley, he not only said he did, but he left him in the library. So Sarah went downstairs to the library, but instead of seeing Jim, she saw Edward. So without having a second thought, that's when Sarah and Edward had a conversation with each other. Meantime, back with Michael and Megan, they had continued to follow the ghost ball because they just left from the upstairs bedroom. Then finally, at long last, they went up the stairs and they have arrived at the attic. Back with Michael and Megan, now that they have arrived in the attic, they have seen a trunk, a wedding dress, and a picture of Edward's long-lost love, Elizabeth. And that's when they, by surprise, had seen Ezra and Emma, that they shouldn't be upstairs in the attic to begin with. And of course, Emma just let slip to the kids that the picture they just saw was Elizabeth. But then they had to hide because both Emma and Ezra just heard someone coming, and it's Ramsley the butler. When Ramsley was asking Ezra and Emma had they seen the children anywhere, and they told him no. But before heading off, that's when Ramsley was telling both Ezra and Emma to get Edward prepared, and so he heads off. Long story short, back with Jim, he had finally arrived at Madame Leota's room. Then, long story short, Madame Leota just told Jim that his only way out of here is if he broke the curse that's in the house. So after that, Jim went upstairs to the attic, and that's when he met up with Megan and Michael, who were also there. Jim just told his children the moment he arrived that they had to leave the house, but Ezra said no way and then told him why, because there's a curse in the house that needs to be broken first. So long story short, it's now Megan's turn to let slip to both her and Michael's father that their mother Sarah's in trouble. And that's when Jim saw it back in the attic, the exact same picture of Elizabeth Shaw that his children seen earlier. Back with Edward, he continues to have a conversation with Sarah how his grandfather was once in love with Elizabeth once upon a time, but when she passed away, he couldn't go on anymore, so he committed suicide. Back in Madame Leota's room, though it is confirmed that Jim and his family had just found out the truth that the reason why they're there to begin with is because, by surprise, Edward is flirting with Sarah. Jim's not very happy about it, and so on top of it all, to anger him even more, he also found out that the house that they're in now is not really for sale. So, Emma was asking Madame Leota if it was true that the ghost of Elizabeth Shaw has come back. She not only said yes, but looks can be deceiving. Break the curse, that's when Madame Leota told Jim that there's a key that needs to be found and is located in the mausoleum. That once the key was found, then the truth to Edward can be revealed. So Jim and his children are more than happy to go on this mission, but there's a problem how to get out of the house. Well, leave it to Ezra and the ghost horse-made carriage to be exact. Long story short, back with Jim and along with Megan and Michael, they have finally arrived at the mausoleum. Well, luckily for Megan, she studied Latin, and she had translated the warning on the front of the door. Of course, she was told by Jim, her and Michael's father, to stay with Michael for a while he goes and finds the key in the crypt. So he did, only to find out that minutes later, Michael will be fine according to Megan. So, luckily for her, she spotted the crypt up ahead, so it's up to Jim to get the key from there. So he did. Back with Megan and Jim, they were about to leave the mausoleum, but when Jim saw by surprise that a corpse has come to life, he accidentally drops the key. So he told his daughter Megan to go get it, so she did. While back with Jim, he goes one-on-one with a corpse, and then he beheads him with a torch, of course. But wait! Other corpses were coming to life too. Well, good news for Megan, she found the key, but on the way out, the door slammed shut. So it's now up to Jim and Megan to tell Michael to open the door immediately, but he's still afraid of spiders, so he remembered what his father said back at the house before they left. Michael began to face his fear and unlocks the door and lets his sister and his father out. Now, good news, they're fine. Back with Jim and back at the mansion, that's when Jim was asking Madame Leota to show him the doorway out of the mansion. But Madame Leota just let slip that key's not for the door, it's for the trunk upstairs in the attic. Now remember, that's the exact same attic that Michael and Megan had just left from, and then Jim. So Jim got really upset with Madame Leota, And then he had told her that he had reached his limit. So everybody went upstairs back to the attic, and there's the trunk that he was looking for. Luckily for Jim, he uses the key to open the trunk, and it did. So after he opens the trunk, he was told by Madame Leota to find something in red. He at first found nothing, but then he spotted a letter from Elizabeth Shaw herself, the real deal, before she died. Then Jim opened the letter to read it. It is addressed to Edward that said, quote, "I will marry you." So in other words, Elizabeth didn't commit suicide. She was murdered. Finally, when Ramsley the butler shows up, he told Jim how impressed he was. Now Jim realizes the truth. Elizabeth didn't commit suicide. Ramsley had murdered Elizabeth. So, in a fit of rage, Ramsley told Ezra and Emma that he will deal with them later, so Jim wanted to know why he felt it was necessary to bump up Elizabeth. Ramsley explained to Jim the reason. He said that when Edward fell in love with Elizabeth the night of the masquerade ball, he refused to listen. And why is that? Because according to Ramsley, then we get a flashback of the night of the engagement between Elizabeth and Edward. Ramsley wouldn't allow them to get married, them being Elizabeth and Edward, because according to Ramsley, Edward has everything to live for: money, inheritance, the mansion, and everything else. But so in Ramsley's case, in other words, having Edward to marry Elizabeth could mean a disastrous consequences. So in other words, yes, it's true. He had to bump off Elizabeth. And that's why Edward was so brokenhearted that he committed suicide because of that. Also, Ramsley just let slip to Jim that now that Edward has found his long-lost love, but he had no idea that it's Sarah and not the long-lost Elizabeth he's been waiting for. He's getting married, and it's the only way that the curse of the house will be broken. Jim got upset with this and said that Edward must not marry Sarah because she's not the long-lost Elizabeth he was waiting for. Although Ramsley agrees, but that could be easily arranged according to Ramsley what he says in his case. After Jim had found out that Ramsley's a ghost too, that's a surprise twist also, that's when Ramsley decided to lock Megan and Michael into the trunk. Now Jim's really enraged and then tells Ramsley to let them out and show him the way out. Well, Ramsley could easily fix that, so what he did is that he lifts Jim out in the air and throws them out from the attic to outside of the house, and that causes Jim to land on his car that's still parked outside. So, oh, by the way, that storm's a fake. Back in the mansion with Sarah and Edward, they have arrived in the ballroom, and that's when by surprise, Edward just told Sarah that at last they're going to be together again. At first Sarah was confused, and then by surprise, Edward just let slip to Sarah that Sarah, was the long-lost Elizabeth that he was waiting for all this time so they could be reunited at last. But Sarah denies the claim that Edward said and tells them that she's not Elizabeth. And so she runs off, and he's trying to convince her otherwise. And so Sarah, upset, goes to the master bedroom where she locks the door. Distraught and upset, just told Ramsley when he appeared out of nowhere that maybe Sarah's not Elizabeth after all. But then, on the other hand, Ramsley had to convince him otherwise that she's indeed her. Back with Jim, who was outside, he has to find his way in, but he had no luck with it. Back with Sarah in the upstairs bedroom of the mansion, when she saw Ramsley, she asked for his help, and the reason being is because she said that Edward has gone crazy. He flipped out. He thinks that she was the long-lost Elizabeth, which of course she's not. But Ramsley had to convince her otherwise by asking her a question. Would she rather go through with the wedding for the sake of her children? Because if she doesn't, according to Ramsley, her children can pay the price. Ramsley, now that he left the bedroom, he told Ezra and Emma to get Sarah ready for the wedding and let there be no more mistakes. So, in other words, he convinced Sarah otherwise to go through with the wedding, even though she doesn't agree with it. Jim, who is still outside the mansion, now distraught and upset, that's when Madame Leota shows up to tell him that he cannot stop trying. Not now. And so Jim just tells her that he's giving up because he's failing and he's running out of time. Not yet, according to Madame Leota in her case. So she tells him to convince him otherwise to try again. So he did, and with his course, and now that he's inside, he good news saved his children, and then he's on his way to stop the wedding, and of course he did. Edward is now all upset and told Jim that he had lost his long-lost love Elizabeth once, but he's not doing it again. But Jim pleads his case to say that she's not Elizabeth and that she's in fact Sarah, and then demands Remsley to tell Edward the truth, but Remsley denies it. Jim, he continues to plead a case with Edward, telling him that Remsley had been lying to him and that he wanted Edward to think that Sarah was the long-lost Elizabeth so that they could get married and break the curse. But again, Remsley denies it, so in anger, Edward threatens to kill Jim. But Jim tells Edward that before he does so, he should read the letter first. And so Edward did. Now remember, that's the exact same letter that Jim found upstairs in the attic. When Edward looked at it and realized that what Jim told him was true, and that is in fact the real Elizabeth who wrote the letter before she died. So he was asking Remsley what's the big deal about it, so finally Remsley confessed. He said that Edward's union to Elizabeth was unacceptable, and by him marrying her it could mean the mansion's downfall. So he did what's necessary. He murdered Elizabeth. He killed her. Edward then pleads his case to say that he had loved Elizabeth so much and asked if it was a mistake to begin with. Well, Remsley not only said that it was a mistake because, according to him, Edward would never understand sacrifice and honor anyway. So after he was confronted, Remsley that is, and since he's a ghost anyway, he was punished for this act of betrayal. So, as for Jim, well, let's just say Edward saves him just in the nick of time. But what about Sarah? Jim thought that he was going to lose her forever. But then a ghost ball appears. Now remember, that's the exact same ghost ball that Megan and Michael saw in the upstairs bedroom. And realized that the ghost ball that they were following earlier was Elizabeth herself. So what the ghost ball did is that it possessed Sarah. So what the ghost of Elizabeth did was to tell Edward the good news, that now that the truth has been revealed to Edward, and it was Jim that had acknowledged her. So she thanked Jim for that. As the film comes to an end, Sarah not only is reunited with Jim after she came back to life, Elizabeth's spirit is now reunited with Edward's, so you know what this means. Now that they're reunited at last, but this time in the afterlife, it was time to leave. But before they did so, Edward has given the deed to the mansion for Jim and his family and told them that they should do whatever they wanted with it. So, Jim and his family not only agreed to the terms, but Edward and Elizabeth's spirits are not the only ones who are going, but Emma and Ezra, they're going too. So, as for everyone else, they finally moved on now that the curse was broken. And as for the Evers, now that they have received everything from the mansion, Madame Leota, and of course the quartet statues. Better than that, the Evers family lived peacefully happy ever after as they head off to the lake.